A muscle car can look bold, loud, and full of attitude, but if the engine under the hood is weak, the whole car fails. These 1990s muscle car engines promised power but delivered nothing but trouble. Number 15. 190 cubic inch LG6 C6, 1990. Back in the late 1980s, General Motors came out with the 190 cubic inch LG6 V6 engine. They built more than 10 million of them until 2005. Well, this engine looked like a smart upgrade from the old 170 cubic inch V6. GM used the same tools to build both engines, only changing the bore size to get more power. That helped them save money, but sadly, it didn't help the people who had to drive with it under the hood. One big reason the LG6 was a failure was the constant intake manifold gasket leaks. These gaskets had plastic parts that would soften and break down. When that happened, coolant leaked into the engine oil. Drivers had no idea until their engines started to overheat or shut down completely. In some cases, it happened as early as 60,000 miles. Fixing it meant tearing the engine apart just to replace the gaskets. Another major issue was the mass airflow sensor, or MAF sensor. Over time, it got dirty from carbon and fuel vapors. That made the engine run either too rich or too lean, which hurt fuel economy and made the car feel rough and weak. In bad cases, it even caused black smoke to come out of the exhaust pipe. Not only this, the engine also had big trouble with the exhaust gas recirculation valve, or EGR valve. Carbon built up under it, which stopped it from closing all the way. That made the engine act like it had a vacuum leak. The car would idle roughly and misfire. Sometimes the engine even knocked under load. There were also leaks from the camshaft rear main oil seal. That meant more messy repairs and oil loss. Even though this engine was used in many cars like the Buick Regal and Chevrolet Lumina, it did not age well. Today, most cars with this engine are worth less than $1,000. People still fix them, but only because they have no choice. Number 14. 140 cubic inch Lima I4, 1991. The 140 cubic inch Lima inline-4 engine was used in the Ford Mustang for many years, starting in 1974 when it was first called the 140 cubic inch engine. It stayed in the Mustang lineup until 1993. After that, it disappeared and never came back, even by the year 2014. This engine never gave the Mustang the power it truly needed. In the year 1991, it made only 89 horsepower at 4,800 revolutions per minute and 120 pound-feet of torque at 3,000 revolutions per minute. That was not nearly enough for a car known for speed and strength. However, Ford tried to make it better by changing the cylinder head and adding 2 spark plugs per cylinder. This pushed horsepower up to 105, but it still didn't impress buyers. Around the same time, the price of the base Mustang went over $10,000 and sales started to fall. Even though the convertible got a new roof and the V8 model got shiny wheels, the weak Lima engine left many Mustang fans disappointed. It just was not strong enough to carry the Mustang name. Number 13. 190 cubic inch LH0 V6, 1992. In the early 1990s, muscle car fans were expecting power, speed, and excitement. But when Chevrolet and Pontiac put the 190 cubic inch LH0 V6 engine in the Camaro and Firebird, many people were left disappointed. This engine was supposed to be an upgrade, but it turned out to be a weak spot in these bold and fast-looking cars. Speaking of a powerhouse, the LH0 engine made only 140 horsepower and 180 pound-feet of torque. For a sports car, that was simply not enough. Drivers expected their Camaros and Firebirds to roar down the road. Instead, this engine felt soft and slow. Compared to the bigger and stronger engines of the past, the LH0 V6 just did not deliver the power people wanted. Another problem was that the LH0 engine used an older design in front-wheel drive cars, while the rear-wheel drive versions had a different setup. This made the engine harder to work on or replace because parts did not always match. It also meant that even though it was the same engine name, it performed and fit differently depending on the car. In 1992, GM tried to make the Firebird better by fixing some squeaks and rattles with stronger bonding glue in the car's frame, but no changes were made to improve the engine itself. The LH0 V6 stayed weak. Even small details like silver valve covers were taken away and replaced with plain black ones. The throttle body plates, which once proudly said tune port injection, were left blank. This made the engine bay look unfinished and cheap. Additionally, the special Firehawk version was still offered that year, but hardly anyone knew about it. Many dealers did not even advertise it, and its high price scared buyers away. Meanwhile, the Firebird lineup was being quietly wrapped up as GM prepared for the next generation. Very few cars were sold, and even fewer people were excited about the V6 engine under the hood. Even with bright new colors and small design changes, nothing could hide the fact that the LH0 V6 was just not right for a performance car. Number 12. 134 cubic inch Turbo 3i4, 1993. In the early 1990s, Dodge and Chrysler wanted to prove they could build small engines with big power, so they made the 134 cubic inch Turbo 3 inline-4 engine. It had a fancy 16-valve head designed by Lotus and made 224 horsepower and 217 pound-feet of torque. No doubt it sounded like a rocket, but in real life, it caused more problems than it solved. The Turbo 3 engine was used in only a few cars. These included the Dodge Spirit RT, Chrysler Spirit RT in Mexico, and Dodge Daytona IROC RT. Fewer than 2,000 cars got this engine. Even though it was rare, that did not make it great. In fact, it was full of problems that made owning and fixing it a nightmare. One of the biggest flaws was the engine design itself. The engine had no coolant passages between the cylinders. That made it harder to keep cool. When the engine gets hot, it could wear out faster or break important parts. Also, the cast iron block made the engine heavy. Even with all the fancy upgrades, it was not a modern or smart design. Despite this, the engine used a timing belt, which needed regular replacement. If the belt broke, it could stop the engine completely. Luckily, it was a non-interference engine, so it would not destroy itself. But that did not make it easy to work on. With its turbo setup and tight space, repairs were often slow and expensive. Also, the bore and stroke measurements made the engine long and not great at high speeds. It had limits when it came to making even more power. Because the bore spacing was small, you could not make the pistons bigger, which limited any future upgrades. Even though the Turbo 3 was fuel-injected and high-tech for its time, it came too late. Chrysler had already begun to move away from turbocharged engines. In the years that followed, they started building newer 122 cubic inch and 146 cubic inch engines. The last cars with the Turbo 3 were sold in 1993, and then it was gone for good. So Turbo 3 looked strong, but in real life, it was hard to fix, ran hot, and was used in too few cars to make a real difference. It promised a lot, but delivered very little. Number 11. 262 cubic inch L99 V8, 1994. In 1994, Chevrolet put the smallest V8 engine ever made by GM, the 262 cubic inch L99, into one of their biggest cars, the full-size Caprice Classic. This made many people confused. Why would such a heavy car get such a small engine? The result was a car that looked big and bold on the outside, but felt weak and slow when you hit the gas. The L99 V8 looked like the stronger 350 cubic inch LT1, but it was far from powerful. It made only 200 horsepower and 245 pound-feet of torque. That was much less than what the larger LT1 could do. For a big car like the Caprice, this engine just didn't have enough power to move it with confidence. It felt soft when driving, especially when trying to pass or go uphill. Moreover, this small engine also used a short-runner LT1 intake, which did not help the low-end torque that the Caprice badly needed. The short runners were better for high-speed power, not for pulling a heavy car from a stop. What the L99 really needed was more torque at lower speeds, but the short runner intake worked against that goal. When tested, the L99 with the stock LT1 intake made 277 horsepower at 5,900 revolutions per minute and 279 pound-feet of torque at 4,100 revolutions per minute. These numbers might sound okay, but they were only possible after adding a better camshaft, valve springs, roller rockers, and other upgrades. In its stock form, the engine was much weaker and less exciting. Even after trying to fix the torque issue by switching to the longer runner LB9 or L98 tune port intake, the results were mixed. The torque went up to 293 pound-feet, which helped at low speeds, but horsepower dropped to just 252. So the car felt better in traffic, but it lost strength at higher speeds. It was a trade-off that still didn't make the engine great. In addition, the L99 used small chamber iron heads with poor airflow. These heads could not match the performance of the larger LT1 heads, which had bigger valves and better breathing. On top of that, the L99's small bore and short stroke gave it little room for power upgrades. It shared pistons with a 305 cubic inch Vortec engine, but had longer connecting rods, making it harder to find good aftermarket parts. This engine also used an optical ignition pickup and reverse cooling, like the LT1, but its design added more complexity without delivering more power. While it gave slightly better fuel mileage than the larger engine, it came with a big loss in performance. Number 10. 280 cubic inch SOHC Modular V8, 1995. In 1995, Ford's 280 cubic inch V8 engine was part of Ford's new modular engine family, meant to replace the old small block V8s. This engine had a single overhead camshaft and 2 valves per cylinder. Ford put it in big cars like the Lincoln Town Car and Crown Victoria, hoping it would offer modern performance, better fuel economy, and smoother driving. But even though it was new and different, the engine came with many problems that made it less exciting. Starting with the biggest issue, this engine was just too weak for the heavy cars it powered. In the Lincoln Town Car, the engine only made 190 horsepower and 260 pound-feet of torque. That might sound okay, but for a big luxury sedan, it felt underpowered. Drivers often complained that the engine was slow to respond, especially when trying to speed up or pass another car. Another problem was how complex the engine was. The 280 cubic inch V8 was built in 2 different factories, one in Romeo, Michigan, and the other in Windsor, Ontario. Even though they made the same engine, each factory used different parts. Some engines had bolt-on camshaft sprockets, while others used press-on sprockets. Some had 11 bolts on the valve covers, others had 13. The crankshafts were different too. Some used 6 bolts, and others used 8. This meant that even though the engines looked the same, not all parts could be swapped easily. If someone needed to repair or rebuild the engine, they had to be very careful to get the right parts. Beyond this, there were also problems with how the engine sounded and felt. Many drivers reported ticking noises from the engine, especially at idle. These sounds came from loose timing chains or poorly designed camshaft followers. The engine also didn't run very smoothly. It often felt shaky at low speeds, and some engines developed misfires over time. While these issues didn't always break the engine, they made driving less enjoyable and more stressful. The cylinder block was another weak point. Some engines used cast iron, while others used aluminum. The aluminum blocks were lighter, but not as strong. They were more likely to wear out early or develop cracks. This made people worry about how long the engine would last, especially if the car had high mileage. Even though the engine had some modern features, like chain-driven cams and new firing orders, these didn't help much. The engine was supposed to be advanced, but it ended up being more complicated, harder to fix, and not very powerful. It also lacked low-end torque, so it struggled when pulling heavy loads or driving up hills. Number 9. 204 cubic inch DOHC LQ1 V6, 1996. The 1996 204 cubic inch dual overhead cam V6 engine, known as the LQ1, had 4 camshafts, 4 valves per air cylinder, and was made to sound like a high-performance machine. This engine made 215 horsepower and 220 pound-feet of torque. But even though the numbers sounded big, the engine had many problems that made it a tough choice for drivers and mechanics. One major problem was how tall the engine was. The LQ1 used a chain-driven shaft that turned 4 camshafts using a belt. This setup made the engine much taller than others, which caused space issues under the hood. The tall size also made it harder to fix or work on, even for simple repairs. Another issue was the change made in 1996. That year, the cylinder heads were redesigned to improve airflow and meet new emissions rules. These new parts made the engine an interference design. This meant that if the timing belt broke, the valves could crash into the pistons and destroy the engine. That made the engine much riskier and more expensive to maintain. In addition, the design of the heads and intake parts also became more complicated in 1996. They added larger exhaust ports, a bigger throttle body, and longer intake runners. The camshafts were changed too, but this made the engine run better only at high speeds. At lower speeds, the power felt weaker and slower, which was a problem for daily drivers. This engine shared very few parts with its simpler pushrod cousins, like the 189 cubic inch V6. Even though they came from the same engine family, almost nothing matched. Only the crankshaft and connecting rods were similar. That made it harder to find parts or use cheaper replacements. Plus, the engine was only used in front-wheel drive cars on the W-body platform, like the Chevrolet Lumina and Pontiac Grand Prix. It came with a 4-speed automatic that was also known to be sensitive and tricky to replace. The gearbox had many versions, and using the wrong one could make the car stop working completely. Number 8. 232 cubic inch Series 2, 3800 VI6, 1997. The 1997 232 cubic inch Series 2, 3800 VI6 engine was supposed to be one of the best engines made by General Motors. It made 205 horsepower and 230 pound-feet of torque. It could also go over 30 miles per gallon on the highway. But even with all this good talk, the engine had some serious problems that caused real trouble for many car owners. One of the biggest flaws was the plastic intake manifold. This part was known to crack, especially around the EGR passage. When this happened, coolant would leak inside the engine. That would sometimes cause the engine to hydrolock, which means water or coolant fills the cylinders and stops the pistons from moving. This could bend the rods and even crack the engine block. Many people had to throw away the whole engine after this happened. There was also a major recall in the year 2009. Over 1.5 million vehicles with this engine were recalled because oil would leak from the valve cover gaskets. That oil could drip onto the hot exhaust parts and catch fire. If that fire reached the plastic spark plug wire holders, it could spread across the engine bay. General Motors had to make new spark plug wire holders to help stop the fires from spreading. Even though the engine was made of strong cast iron and had a solid history, these problems made it risky to own if not taken care of properly. A small crack in the intake or a bad repair job could lead to complete engine failure. Some engines were so damaged that they had bent rods, blown head gaskets, or broken blocks, all because of coolant leaks or overheating. The 3800 Series 2 engine could still run after taking serious damage, and many people say it refused to die. But that toughness does not erase the fact that the intake manifold and gasket problems made it a hard engine to trust. These problems hurt many good cars, even when the rest of the engine was still strong. Number 7. 189 cubic inch LG8 V6, 1999. The 1999 189 cubic inch LG8 V6 engine was meant to be an improvement, but the truth was different once the engine started running. It was built with an iron block and aluminum heads, and had a design that used push rods with only 2 valves per cylinder. Moreover, the LG8 also had a new intake manifold and used a system called full sequential port fuel injection, which was supposed to help the engine breathe better. But these changes did not fix the deeper problems hidden inside. One big issue was that the engine was still very old-fashioned. Even though it was updated, it still kept the same short stroke and bore from earlier engines. This gave it a weak and rough performance. It had a compression ratio of 9.6 to 1, but it only made between 170 and 175 horsepower. That was not much for an engine this size. The torque was also low, between 190 and 195 pound-feet. For cars that needed to carry families and cargo, this meant slow speed and poor response on the road. On top of that, the main problem was how the engine handled emissions. The LG8 used a system called secondary air injection. This system added air into the exhaust to help burn leftover fuel gases. But this also brought a new set of troubles. The extra heat from the second burn could hurt the exhaust valves. Sometimes the exhaust system would even glow red hot from the heat. Over time, this extra heat could lead to damage to the engine parts and shorten the life of the engine. Even though the LG8 was built in modern places like Mexico and New York, it still had many flaws. It tried to share parts with the bigger 207 cubic inch engine, but this led to mismatched designs and more chances for failure. Drivers who had this engine often complained about its weak power, high heat, and poor reliability. Number 6. 153 cubic inch KLDE V6, 1993. The 1993 153 cubic inch KLDE V6 engine was used in cars like the Mazda MX-6, 626, and even the Ford Probe. It was made of aluminum, had 6 cylinders, and used 24 valves. The fuel system used something called distributed injection, and the engine made between 165 and 175 horsepower. These numbers made it sound like a powerful and smooth engine, but drivers learned the hard way that it was not always reliable. First, let's talk about its main issue. The engine block was made of aluminum, and it got damaged easily when it overheated. The cooling system had to be watched closely. If the car got too hot, serious damage could happen quickly. Even though the engine did not often have head gasket problems, overheating was the one thing that could cause them. Once overheated, it could ruin the whole engine. Another common problem was with the valve cover gaskets. Many drivers found that these gaskets started leaking before the car reached over 62,000 miles. Oil would drip out, and it would create a mess inside the engine bay. This leak was not just annoying, it could also lead to more engine problems if not fixed quickly. The timing belt also needed attention. It usually lasted around 49,000 to 53,000 miles. And although it did not bend the valves when it broke, replacing it was still important. There were more troubles inside the engine. Many owners said the hydraulic lifters started making knocking sounds very early, sometimes even before 31,000 miles. Some also found heavy sludge buildup and thick carbon deposits on the valves and cylinder heads. This meant the engine was not always clean inside and could lose power over time. Some mechanics said the valves were not the strongest, and they could wear out faster than expected. Even though this engine had a good sound and strong numbers, it showed serious flaws when pushed hard or not cared for properly. Number 5. 183 cubic inch Mitsubishi 6G72 V6, 1994. Back in 1994, the Mitsubishi 183 cubic inch 6G72 V6 engine was a big part of many cars like the Dodge Caravan, Mitsubishi Eclipse GT, Galantin, and even some powerful-looking sports cars like the 3000 GT and Dodge Stealth. But this engine had many problems hiding under the surface that made it one of the worst V6 engines of its time. While it came in different versions like single overhead cam with 12 valves, 24 valves, and even a double overhead cam with turbochargers, none of them could escape major flaws. The first issue was the low power in early versions. Some of the older single overhead cam 12-valve engines only made 141 horsepower and 172 pound-feet of torque. For a V6 engine, that was weak and disappointing. Even when it was upgraded in the Mitsubishi Pajero to a better version, it only reached around 146 horsepower. That was not enough to move big, heavy vehicles. It felt slow and tired, especially when going uphill or trying to pass other cars. Even though some versions had 24 valves and higher horsepower, like 195 horsepower in the Eclipse GT, they still didn't offer a strong driving feel. The power came late in the engine's range, which made everyday driving feel sluggish. The turbocharged versions in the Mitsubishi 3000 GT and Dodge Stealth looked like high-performance cars. But even with 2 turbochargers, the engine had a very low compression ratio of 8.0 to 1. That meant it needed more boost to make power, which caused extra stress on the engine and made it harder to keep running right for many years. Another problem was the engine's complicated layout. The double overhead cam versions had 24 valves, and in turbo form, each side of the V6 had its own turbocharger and intercooler. This made repairs expensive and very hard for regular mechanics to fix. Parts were crowded and difficult to reach. This also meant more chances for something to break. Even the naturally aspirated versions were known for being hard to maintain. Despite being used in many cars, the 6G72 struggled with power, reliability, and ease of repair. It had too many versions, but none of them were truly great. Number 4. 146 cubic inch LD 9 twin cam Y4, 1996. In 1996, General Motors brought out a new engine called the 146 cubic inch LD9 twin cam. It was part of the Quad 4 family and used in cars like the Pontiac Sunfire and Chevrolet Cavalier. People thought it would be a strong, sporty 4-cylinder engine with 150 horsepower and better torque than before. But instead of becoming a trusted motor, it turned into a nightmare for many owners due to its long list of serious problems. The most common issue was with the timing chain. This chain was supposed to keep the engine running in perfect timing, but it often failed. When the timing chain broke, the engine could stop working completely and repairs were expensive. These failures happened far too often, leaving drivers stranded and frustrated. To make things worse, the engine also had water pump problems. The water pump is what keeps the engine cool, but on the LD9, it was hard to reach and even harder to replace. Mechanics had to take apart many parts just to get to it, making it one of the most costly repairs on the engine. Well, the engine looked modern on the outside, but it had very small oil passages inside. These tiny passages made it hard for oil to flow smoothly through the engine. Without enough oil reaching important parts, the engine would wear out faster. If the car owner didn't keep up with perfect maintenance, the engine could break down early and need a full rebuild. Well, the company tried to fix some of these problems in later years, like using better timing chains, a new water pump, and improved oil passages. But the problems were already too big. The early versions were too unreliable. The engine speed would sometimes act strangely, and the starter motor, knock sensor, and other small parts were often weak and needed replacement. The LD9 twin cam had high hopes, but all its design problems turned it into a high-risk engine. From timing chain troubles to oil flow issues and water pump nightmares, the engine gave owners more stress than strength. Number 3. 152 cubic inch V6, 1997. In 1997, Ford used a 152 cubic inch Duratech V6 engine in cars like the Mercury Cougar and Ford Mondeo. It looked advanced with aluminum parts, dual overhead cams, and 24 valves. People expected smooth power and great performance. It had 170 horsepower and was built with help from famous companies like Porsche and Cosworth. But even with all that expert support, the engine came with serious flaws that made it a headache for many drivers. The first big issue was with the water pump. It was placed deep inside the engine, making it very hard to reach. When it failed, fixing it cost a lot of money and took many hours of labor. This made simple cooling problems turn into big repair jobs. Even though the engine had a chain instead of a belt for the camshaft, it did not save owners from repair trouble. Also, there is an engine design that made it harder for oil to flow well. It had tight spaces inside where oil moved slowly. Without strong oil movement, the engine could wear down faster and overheat. That meant drivers had to keep a close eye on oil levels and maintenance, or risk major engine damage. While the engine did offer steady torque from low to high speed, it still suffered from noise and shaking. Ford had aimed for lower noise, vibration, and harshness, but many drivers felt the engine was not as smooth as promised. The extra parts like balance shafts and variable intake systems added to the complexity, which made repairs more expensive and more likely. Even with a strong crankshaft and high-tech casting methods, the engine's reliability did not match its high build quality. The overcapacity oil pump and efficient cooling system still could not save the engine from its deep-seated problems. Many parts were designed to look good on paper, but failed to make life easier for the driver. Number 2. 232 cubic inch supercharged Essex V6, 1990. In 1990, Ford used a 232 cubic inch supercharged Essex V6 engine. It had a strong cast iron block and heads and was used in many cars like the Mustang, Taurus, and Windstar. The engine had a wide reach across Ford's lineup, and many people trusted it to handle both daily driving and light truck work. But even though it was meant to be tough and reliable, this engine had many serious problems that made it one of the worst choices for drivers back then. The worst part, the Essex V6, was the head gasket failure. These gaskets sit between the engine block and cylinder heads and help keep coolant and oil in place. In this engine, they often failed early, especially in the 1994 and 1995 models. This caused coolant to leak into the engine, leading to overheating, loss of power, and major engine damage. Fixing the head gasket was expensive, and sometimes it damaged the engine so badly it had to be replaced completely. Speaking of build quality, it had a wide 90-degree layout, which made it harder to balance than other V6 engines. This design led to more vibration and noise, and over time, these shaking forces could wear out engine parts faster. The older ignition system and carburetor setup in early models also didn't help with smooth driving or reliable starting, especially in cold weather. Beyond this, Ford later gave the engine fuel injection and made updates. It still suffered from poor cooling and pressure buildup. The water-cooled system had to work extra hard, and when paired with weak gasket materials, it caused many engines to fail too soon. The supercharged version added more stress, which made the head gasket problems even worse. Many people who owned this engine had to visit the repair shop more than they wanted. Ford tried to fix these problems over time by changing the gasket materials and redesigning engine parts, but the damage to the engine's reputation was already done. Number 1. 152 cubic inch Mitsubishi 6G73 V6, 1995. In 1995, Mitsubishi introduced a 152 cubic inch V6 engine called the 6G73. What's the impressive part? It had 24 valves, a strong cast iron block, and aluminum heads. It was used in many cars like the Mitsubishi Galant, Diamante, Dodge Avenger, and Chrysler Sebring. People hoped it would be smooth, but this engine had a long list of problems that made it more trouble than it was worth. One major issue was the GDI version, which used a direct fuel injection system. This setup was known for breaking often. The biggest problem was the high-pressure fuel pump. It failed regularly and cost a lot to fix. Even though the engine was not too picky about fuel in other versions, the GDI system caused headaches for many car owners. Even though the engine looked reliable, many people complained about burning too much oil. After about 124,000 miles, the valve stem seals wore out, or the piston rings stopped working right. This caused oil to leak into the engine, which led to high oil consumption. If drivers didn't check their oil levels often, it could lead to even worse damage, like broken bearings. Not to mention engine speed, the engine's idle would jump up and down, and there were many reasons for this. Sometimes the throttle body or fuel injectors got dirty. Other times the idle controller stopped working. Broken wires, damaged oxygen sensors, or a poorly installed manifold after changing spark plugs could also cause the engine to run badly. These problems were hard to track down and made the car feel shaky and unreliable. Even the timing belt, which was supposed to last a long time, could break without warning. This happened when oil leaked from the front of the engine or when the hydraulic tensioner got clogged with dirt. The oil would drip straight onto the belt, making it weak. When the belt snapped, the engine could be ruined. The 6G73 tried to be a good V6 engine, but too many problems kept it from being dependable. Which of these engines do you think was the worst? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more muscle car breakdowns.